Hi, everyone. My name is Marcy Stagner from the Memphis JCC. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I guess I should read the introduction that I actually wrote. It's good evening, everyone. Welcome to this installment of Lit Fest Live in your living room, or Book Fest, if that's what your community calls it, in partnership with the Memphis, Nashville, and New Orleans JCCs. My name is Marcy Stagner, and I'm the Program Director of Cultural Arts and Adult Services at the Memphis JCC. We are thrilled to welcome Myla Goldberg to your screen tonight and into your home, thanks to the Jewish Book Council, the patrons of the arts at the Memphis JCC, Vanderbilt Jewish Studies, and the Vanderbilt Creative Writing Program. Myla Goldberg is the best-selling author of The False Friend, Wicked's Remedy, and Bee Season, which was a New York Times notable book, which was a New York Times notable book, and a winner of the Borders New Voices Prize, a finalist for the Hemingway Foundation's PEN Award, and was adapted to film and widely translated. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And if you've not read the book yet, I suggest you go out and get it. It's available at all of our local booksellers. Of course, it's available at places like Barnes & Noble and Amazon as well. Our local bookseller in Memphis is Novel Memphis, but it's available at all of our local booksellers. My book club just finished reading the book. We loved it. My book club friends are on the call right now. So thank you, everybody from Nashville to New Orleans to Memphis and anywhere else that you might be joining from. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're in for a real treat. And I want to welcome Myla to your screen, to your home.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, it's so weird that we're doing things this way, but so cool that we can. And I'm especially grateful to Marcy, Alex, and Judy for being super creative. I've done approximately 8 gazillion of these Zoom events, but this is the first one where a bunch of JCCs have gotten together and kind of collaborated. And I think that's a really neat use of this technology. And I want to thank all of you guys for being weird with us tonight and doing this strange technological thing so we can keep being a community together. And the book in question, by the way, is Feast Your Eyes. She actually didn't tell you that part. This is the new book. And it's also gotten, it's been doing great. It's been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. It was a finalist for the Carnegie Medal, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. And so what I'm going to do is first I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to read to you a little bit from the book. And then comes my favorite part, which is talking to you guys about the book, getting any of your questions about it. And it'll be like we're having an actual conversation, even though we're thousands of miles from each other, even in different time zones. So this book started for me with a question. I basically start with the question, is it possible to be both an excellent artist and an excellent parent? Or to be one of those really well, do you have to toss the other one to the curb? Not an academic question when it came into my head at the time. At that time, my kids were ages 4 and 7, so I was in the thick of it. And I was basically in perpetual conflict. When I was writing, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to be with my kids right now. And when I was with my kids, I was like, I need to be writing. So it was just, I was never at peace, and I was always just confused, honestly. And so that's basically when I turned to writing. The reason I'm a writer is it gives me a way to explore the things that I'm frightened of, the things that I'm curious about, people that I'm interested in. And so this is what drew me to kind of write about this. And so the way I like to talk about it is fiction for me is always personal, which is to say I'm going to draw upon an emotional experience of mine, a psychological experience of mine, a question that I have. However, fiction for me is not autobiographical. And so there's a big distinction there for me. Autobiographical fiction is kind of all the rage. It's like coming up as the big thing. I think the ascendancy of the memoir has made the autobiographical novel also sort of a big thing. I can't stand it, just me. It's because I'm a private person. You know, maybe after we've hung out for 6 months, we'll go get a beer and we'll talk about our childhoods or whatever, but not what I want to talk about first off. And so when I write, I like protecting my privacy, I also like protecting the privacy of my spouse, my children, my friends. And so I think there's like, that's kind of the art of fiction. The art of fiction for me is allowing myself to explore my life, personal issues, but in a way that isn't drawing directly upon it. And so that's sort of the trick of it. And so with this particular book, it's a great example. I was in the thick of parenting and trying to figure out how to kind of achieve the balance that any one of us who has ever been a parent has tried to achieve. Like, we have these kids, we have ambitions, we have responsibilities outside the house. We want to do all of it. And sometimes it seems we can't do any of it. So as I do whenever I have a question, I started looking for books. In this case, I started looking for role models. I was like, okay, well, are there any artists who did it right? And so I started looking for biographies of female artists and trying to see if I could find someone who like hit that balance right. The answers were not encouraging. I didn't really find one. I came up though with a kind of a spectrum of answers to that question. On the one extreme, I came across Dorothea Wang, and she's the super famous WPA photographer. She went out, took famous pictures during the Dust Bowl. Migrant Woman is kind of, or Migrant Mother, Migrant Woman, oh dear. Anyway, if you saw it, you would recognize it. It is canonical. She had two sons. She gave them to someone else to raise. She paid that person to raise her sons for her, while she then went off and for years took pictures that made her a canonical photographer and the one whose work we esteem so much today. You can read her sons' biographies to see how they felt about that. On the other end of the spectrum, we have someone like Sally Mann. Sally Mann is a photographer who in 1990, I don't know if any of you remember this, she published a collection of her photographs called Immediate Family. And there are these gorgeous, beautifully composed, technically perfect black and white portraits of her children, generally naked, generally outdoors, in these very rich, evocative settings that kind of had a lot of narrative content. And you could kind of look at the kids and tell yourselves a story about what was happening. Those pictures ended up having all sorts of negative repercussions for herself, for her children, for her family, things they had never intended. And so, you know, we had Dorothea Wang who's like, I have to keep these things totally separate. We had Sally Mann who said, I'm just going to put them together. I can't imagine separating them. I'm going to make them one. Neither of those seem to work out so well. So what I realized is the only way for me to answer this question for myself was to write about it. And so that's how this book started. So I started out with my research by reading the biographies of these women. And so I continued my research by then starting to read more about photography. Since I'm a writer, I knew I didn't want to write about a writer. As I said, didn't want to make it autobiographical. So it's all about writing at a distance. So photography gave me a way to write about an artist who might have similar concerns without the artist being the same kind of artist as me. Plus, I've always been a little obsessed with photography. I think the reason why, specifically street photography, is so it took me 8 years to write this book. And even if you're a fast reader, we're talking a week top, you know, maybe shorter, but probably longer. And so that's how long it takes for me to communicate the world for you, to communicate the story to you. You look at a picture, it's like instantaneous. The world is there. The story is there. There's a magic that as a writer, I will never be able to capture. That sort of instantaneous narrative rush. I'm jealous. And I'm also fascinated. How do they do it? So I think that's why I ended up turning to photography. But the more I read about photography and its history, the more I realized what a perfect choice it was. I didn't want to set the book in the present day for the same reason as I was saying before about wanting to give myself distance and perspective. Also, history is fascinating. All of my books are set in different time periods. Bee Season was set in the 80s. My second book, Wicket's Remedy, was actually set during the 1918 influenza epidemic. We can talk about that later. My third book actually was pretty much present day, but mostly I'm a history gal. So as I was doing research, I was reading about photography. And what was interesting is in the 50s, photography was just coming into its own as an art form. Before then, photographs were just considered, you had them in a scrapbook for yourself, like of your family photos, or they would be used in a magazine or a newspaper. But the idea of a photograph as art, that was a revolutionary idea in the 50s. That was just beginning to happen. The idea that you could put a photograph on your wall or have a photograph in a museum and it would be a piece of art. The other thing that was interesting about photography is it was an emerging art form in the 50s, which meant that it was actually open to women in a way that the other art forms were not. In the 50s, pretty hard to make it as a woman as a classical painter. Pretty hard to make it as a sculptor. The men had those sewn up. Patriarchy that we live in, tough luck if you're a gal. But since photography was new, there were openings for women in a way that there weren't in the other forms. And so you had a lot more women going into it. And so these things all sort of started coming together for me. And so I was like, okay. And also, I've been living in New York for about 25 years. I've never written about it. And so I wanted to write about my city. And so I ended up kind of circling around New York, 50s and 60s. This was going to be my place. The thing that really kind of made me realize this was the time period I wanted to write about, though, is as I was doing my research and my reading, I came across a book called The Choices We Made. And one of the big things about the 50s and 60s, it's a pre-Roe v. Wade world. I'm a post-Roe v. Wade baby. I was born in 1971. Intellectually, I had always known that that meant, that pre-Roe v. Wade, very difficult to get an abortion, really hard to do, traumatic, but it was all very abstract. It was not, a kind of ingrained knowledge of any sort. And why is that? Because nobody talks about it. It's kind of interesting and tragic to me that something that has been legal now for almost 50 years is still something that is so shameful and so secret, we still don't talk about it. So I didn't know much about it other than, it used to be illegal. Then I came across this book called The Choices We Made. It is a book of personal essays by women writing about their abortions. The first 20 essays, and it's all by women. They give their names. It's not anonymous. They give their names. They are very known, successful women. They're writing about their illegal abortions. And the things that I learned there literally changed my life. It changed the way I think about a lot of things. One thing is it made very real what those experiences were like. I learned exactly what these women had to do to obtain the abortions that they needed to obtain when it was still an illegal procedure. But what I learned that I had no idea about was not only was abortion illegal, but it was often illegal to obtain birth control. Or if not illegal, extremely difficult. And also it was incredibly difficult just to obtain information about birth control. So you had women who had no choices because they had no access to either information or devices or anything. And so what I kept coming back to in these essays by these women was for them to be an ambitious woman in that time period was to have an abortion. They saw no other way around it. And that was heartbreaking. It changed how I thought about a lot of things. And so I realized that if I didn't know this stuff, and I consider myself to be a fairly well-educated, person, then most people of my generation and people younger than my generation didn't know it either. And it's really important to me that they started to know it. Interestingly, I started writing this book one presidential administration ago. And so when I started writing it, I was like, oh yeah, I am writing historical fiction. Well, then the administration changed. And we all know what's been happening in state legislatures around the country. We all know what just happened with the Supreme Court nomination. History, it's coming back. It's a cycle. It's not historical fiction anymore. The same things are happening again. And so this made it all the more important for me to talk about this in the book, to talk about this with people like you. And so we could hopefully try to make this topic a conversation again, or not again, to take it a conversation for the first time. So this book, Feast Your Eyes, takes the form of the catalog for the posthumous retrospective museum exhibit of fictional photographer Lillian Preston. There are no pictures in the book. Rather, there are the titles of the book, descriptions of the pictures, and then people talking about Lillian. It is her daughter who's doing most of the talking, her daughter Samantha. Samantha was raised by Lillian as a single mother, and in the course of raising her, Lillian was taking lots of pictures of her daughter, naked portraits, regular portraits, her daughter by herself, her and her daughter together. And one of those portraits is of her daughter caring for Lillian when Lillian was suffering the after effects of an illegal abortion. Well, some of those photos of her and her daughter get posted up in a Brooklyn art gallery. That art gallery gets shut down by the Vice Squad. Lillian and the gallery owner get thrown in jail, and their court case ends up making its way up to the Supreme Court and becomes this kind of landmark Supreme Court obscenity laws, freedom of speech, freedom of expression case. And so their lives were very much defined by that moment. And so Samantha, her daughter, is sort of talking about their life kind of refracted through the lens of what that did to them, the way it kind of deformed their relationship to each other, to art, to the world at large. And so you're getting Samantha's perspective, you're getting excerpts from letters and journals of Lillian, and you're also getting excerpts of interviews with all of the people who are most important to Lillian in her life. And so that's how the book works. And so it was interesting because, the choices that Lillian was trying to make about her life, and that I talked about with Dorothea Wang and Sally Mann, they were kind of specialized ideas, like in terms of like, you know, the balancing of kids, how much you use your kids in your work. But nowadays, that's a kind of thing that everybody deals with all the time because of social media, right? We've got mommy blogs, we've got Instagram, we've got YouTube. People are posting stuff of their kids all the time, like, I just posted this video of my kid on the toilet and it gave me 15 likes. I'm going to do a bunch more videos of that. We're not really talking too much about the larger implications of that. We're not having conversations about what does informed consent mean? Can your 6-year-old give you permission to do that? Is it cool to do that? The answer might be yes. But the interesting thing is this is not really a conversation that we're having as a culture. And so I found myself thinking about it a lot as I was working on this book, because I feel like these artists that I already talked about in real life and my fictional one were sort of dealing with that issue in a kind of a primordial way before we got to the sort of everyday way that we're now dealing with it as a culture. So anyway, I'm working on this book. I'm maybe 3, 4, 5 years in, and I'm still wrestling with the very same question. But then I happened to come across an art exhibit that changed my mind about how this was working. I live in Brooklyn, which means I get to go to art museums. Well, under normal circumstances, I get to go to art museums a lot and take advantage of all the culture that's here. And so the Guggenheim, for those of you who've been to New York, or those of you who haven't, big round museum, big old ramp, super fun. And so when they have retrospectives, they'll have the life of the artist kind of chronologically arranged in this ramp. So you start at the bottom, you work way up, and you get through their life. They were having a Louise Bourgeois exhibit. And so I went to check it out. And so there's this thing I do whenever I go to an art exhibit or a museum that I thought everybody did until I started talking about it. And everyone looked at me funny, like, nah, that's just you. So here's the thing I do. When I'm at an art museum, I obsessively look at the little placards next to the piece of art, and I do the math to figure out how old the artist was when they made the work. I started this as a child. As a child, I would go to museums. I'd do the math. I was like, oh, I got 15 years before I have to make something that good. I'm okay. But now that I'm 49, I go to the museum and I do the math. I was like, oh, I needed to have made something that good 20 years ago. Oh, well. But regardless, it is still something that I do. So here I was at the Louise Bourgeois exhibit, and I was doing the math. And so the beginning of the exhibit, it's her early life. There's all this amazing, interesting art. But then it kind of dwindles. And there's this more sort of sparse period where there's not a lot going on. And I started looking at the dates on the placards next to the work. And then I looked at her biography. I was like, oh, she had 3 boys. And right now they're all really small. And that's what's going on right now. And there's not a lot of art. However, then it kept going up the ramp. And all of a sudden, the art came back. And there was more of it. And it was more interesting and more diverse and more accomplished than anything that had happened before. And I looked at the placards again. And I did the math. I was like, oh, her sons are older now. They're a little more independent. She's getting her life back. And that's when something clicked for me. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I've been thinking about being an artist and being a parent as forces that were in opposition to each other. But this makes me realize that that's not the case, because I think there was a relationship between the fact that her art got better on the other side of that really intense period of being a parent. Because what I've been discovering, and for 16, 17 years now, is that being a parent forces you to learn new skills. It forces you to have a new kind of empathy. It forces you to love in new ways. It basically makes you a better human. And anything that makes me a better human makes me a better writer. And I realized that that's what I was seeing in the work of Louise Bourgeois. She had become a better human, and she'd become a better artist as a result. And so that's what kind of helped me to make my peace with the whole thing. It's not any easier, but I've realized that I am going to work slower right now because I am in the thick of being a parent. But the work that I do as a result is going to be richer and better and more accomplished than anything I would have done if I'd never gone down the road of being a parent and trying to do that balance. And it makes me feel better, honestly. And so kind of coming out of the end of this book with that realization, it felt good, and it still does. Still hard, though. My kids are now 17 and 13, so I'm still very much in the thick of it. It's just a different kind of thick of it. And then I guess the last thing I like to talk about is, we're all at JCCs right now. So the question is kind of the $1 million question is this, oh yes, Myla, that's all very nice, but how is any of this Jewish? We're at a JCC right now. How do you speak to that? And so here's what I have to say about that. So when my first novel, Bee Season, was published in 2000 and people started calling me a Jewish writer, I was surprised, but honestly also slightly uncomfortable. In retrospect, of course, it makes perfect sense. I am, after all, a Jew, and I had written a book that had a lot to say about a Jewish family and Jewish mysticism. But until that moment, if someone had asked me what kind of writer I was, I'd have told them I was an American writer and pretty much left it at that. I think the added label bristled because it made me feel like I was being placed inside a box that would keep my work separate from the larger world I was inhabiting and addressing. And this speaks, I think, to a happy problem that lies at the center of what it means to be Jewish in America in the 21st century. For the great majority of our history, Jews have defined themselves by their religious practices and by their isolation. Larger society wouldn't have us, so we build a society of our own. Jewish thought, Jewish practice, Jewish foods, and Jewish life all evolved and thrived over centuries to create this rich cultural fabric that we clothed ourselves in response to being denied access to all the surrounding cultures that excluded us and wished us harm. And this culminated in the wake of the Holocaust with the establishment of the Jewish homeland of Israel. So, growing up in the Maryland suburbs, I was shaped by the culture that prized these things. I went to Hebrew school twice a week. I attended Shabbat services every Friday night. I celebrated Passover and Hanukkah at home and observed all the other Jewish holidays at the Reconstructionist synagogue my family attended, culminating in my bat mitzvah. I grew up learning about the discrimination, oppression, and violence that defines so much of our past and influences parts of our present. I spent a lot of time as a kid imagining what it would have been like if I'd been born in Germany in 1931 instead of Washington, D.C. in 1971. And I was taught to cherish Israel. The thing was, as I grew older, I felt increasingly distant from most of those values. In my own life, for example, I experienced very little anti-Semitism. I mean, while there weren't many Jews in my neighborhood, and I definitely felt different and weird for not celebrating Christmas or Easter, I was targeted more for being a nerd who wore glasses than I was for being Jewish. So while I understood the role that kind of hate played in the history of my culture and in contemporary communities other than my own, it was not a part of my own life. As I grew older, I also found that I didn't relate to the religious aspects of Jewish practice. I discovered that my personal faith lay in the capacity for humankind to do good, and that my spirituality lay in the generative and mysterious kind of power of human imagination and creativity, which standard Jewish services and observance did not really intersect with. I also realized that I had a much more complex relationship to the state of Israel than the one I'd been brought up with. I don't think my story is that unusual. I think there are a lot of American Jews today who are largely secular, who grapple with their relationship to Israel, and for whom anti-Semitism is not a personal, daily, existential issue, which creates a dilemma. What is left to hold us together? Holidays and rituals will always be valuable, but for someone who defines themselves as secular, is that going to be a strong enough force for cohesion? Should one's sense of community be ruled by what one thinks about the policies and politics of a country on the other side of the planet? While anti-Semitism still exists, and within America's current political and cultural climate, it is growing and is a danger, should an awareness of this and the fear and mistrust that define that awareness lie at the core of what defines us as a culture? Well, as far as I'm concerned, the thing to hold us together is the very thing that poses a challenge to our identity, and that is contemporary American life itself. If I were to list the qualities that I associate with my Jewish identity, I would say tolerance, activism, skepticism, dialogue, engagement, altruism, and empathy. Now, none of those qualities are unique to Judaism, but in me, they form a unique constellation created in large part by my Jewish upbringing. If we're to remain relevant as a culture, I think we need to turn our eyes toward today's issues, come together to discuss them, and then add our unique voices to the larger national conversation. Any issue that affects our lives as a community is a Jewish issue, be it family life, reproductive rights, gender equality, gun control, criminal justice, or any of the bewildering array of contemporary complexities that shape 21st century America. Well, once I realized that, the discomfort I'd initially felt about being called a Jewish writer fell away, because I no longer felt like it was a box I was being placed in, but a description of one of the lenses I use to inhabit, explore, and create literature within the larger world. And so, when I wrote about Abraham Abulafia in my first book, sure, I was doing it as a Jewish writer, but I was also being a Jewish writer in my second novel when I wrote about the 1918 influenza epidemic, and in my third novel when I was writing about memory and friendship. And when I tackle issues like work-life balance and feminism and pre-Roe v. Wade America in my current book, I'm doing it through a uniquely Jewish lens. And by being together here today, we're demonstrating that we understand the importance of expanding our collective idea of what Jewish culture and literature mean. And for that, I'm grateful and excited, and I'm grateful that we're all here together. So with that, I am going to read to you a little bit from the book. Since you already know everything about it, I don't have to tell you anything in advance. I guess all I'll tell you is you'll be hearing from Samantha, describing some of her mother's photos. You'll be hearing from Deborah Brodsky, who was one of Lillian's closest friends, and you'll be hearing a little bit at the very end from Lillian's journal. Woman on Park Bench, New York, 1954. Deborah Brodsky. I remember one of a woman sitting. She's wearing a little hat and a nice dress, and you can tell she lives in a nice apartment somewhere, only at that moment she's got her shoes off and she's using one foot to massage the other. She's got this look on her face of fatigue, but also bewilderment, and you can tell she started out life in a place where there weren't little hats and nice dresses. When I asked Lily how she did it, how she found people in these moments, she looked at me like I'd asked her how to tie a shoe. I wait, she said. So one day I followed her to Washington Square. Sundays it was all guitars and young men singing folk songs, people collecting for righteous causes, and willowy girls wearing macrame belts and dangly earrings. But on Mondays, when Lily went, the park belonged to everyone. I made sure to stand at a distance so Lily wouldn't know I was there. In a way, it was like being in the dark room with her. I was still watching her conjure an image, only this time we were out in the world, and her images were rising to the surface of the moment instead of the paper. Lily would sit for a while in one place, then she'd get up and sit somewhere else. She told me she used a 35mm viewfinder camera because it was small, fast, and quiet. And out in the park, I saw what she meant. She held that camera the way you'd hold a drink at a party when you're busy talking, with a relaxed arm bent at the elbow, always at the same place by her hip. Lily never looked down, almost as if she'd forgotten the camera was there, but really, it was just part of her. She'd taken so many pictures holding it at her hip that she didn't need to look down to use it anymore, the same way any other person doesn't need to look at their hand to open a door. Even watching her, it took a while to catch on that she was taking pictures. She would look off into the distance like she was just hanging around, and this was how she'd find what she wanted. If her subject was far away, she'd walk herself into range. She'd pre-focused her camera to a focal range of 10 feet. She'd internalized this distance over countless hours of practice. Anytime, anywhere, she could tell you what was 10 feet away from her at any given moment, and she was always right. This helped her take pictures quickly, without anyone noticing. For each picture, she'd position herself at that same 10-foot distance, always keeping the camera at that one spot at her hip. The way I'm describing it makes it sound slow, but it happened fast. Next, she would turn her head without turning her body, like she was interested in something else. It seemed so innocent, just a young woman in a quiet moment, but that was when she was really looking. She was doing it the way a bird does, with one eye. The real action wasn't there, though. If you kept watching her face, you'd miss the whole thing because she never raised her camera to look through the viewfinder. The camera stayed down around where a belt buckle would be, and while she was looking with one eye, she was making small tilts of her wrist, tiny adjustments to compose the shot. That eye and that hand were connected by countless hours of practice, perfect coordination built shot by shot over a small eternity of trial and error. Then the adjustments would stop and the shutter would click. And if you were looking at her face, you'd miss the whole thing. What I noticed about Lily the day I met her was what worked for her out in the world. She looked like she belonged inside a nice, quiet house somewhere. She had what you'd call regular features, everything even and proportionate. She always wore solid colors and knee-length skirts, and people paid her no mind. I admired that about her because she was doing exactly what she needed to do. Even the rare person who did notice her didn't get bent out of shape. There was no way he could. You couldn't blame Lily for taking pictures any more than you could blame a pigeon for pecking at a crumb of bread. On Tuesdays, a bunch of us would come together at my place to share whatever we happened to have. Beans, greens, beer, bread, grass, a can of anchovies. And we'd eat and drink and talk and get high. And if there were friends of friends passing through, they'd come and tell us where they'd been. Occasionally, things got pretty wild. People would pair off in combinations that didn't match the pairs they'd arrived in or that weren't pairs at all. Sometimes this felt like exploring a new way to live, and sometimes it just felt like a bad idea. Lily wasn't part of that. She didn't drink much, and she didn't smoke, not even cigarettes. On the nights things got tangled, she'd have wandered back to her darkroom long before, but the way she held herself wasn't separate. It wasn't judgment. It was just her, being herself. Charles in Central Park, New York, 1954. I'm betting the picnic basket in the picture is his. My mother wasn't the type to spring for wicker when a knapsack would do. It would be a simple snapshot if not for the shadows. Charles's shadow overlaps the trees, making his gray outline look like dangling fruit. This lends the whole thing an erotic undertone that was pretty daring coming from a girl photographer in 1954. Deborah Brodsky. I only saw the father once when he wasn't the father yet. He was just Charles from Lily's photography class. When Lily invited Charles to a Tuesday night, he showed up in a coat and tie with a bottle of wine. Well, right away, he was invited to lose all three by Ronaldo as he and a friend of his, wearing matching red tunics, performed a dance with a candle and a painted mirror. Lily tried to make Charles comfortable. She even gave him her camera to hold, but two of them didn't stick around. After that, Charles always seemed to have something else going on Tuesdays. Lily told me she felt conflicted. She liked him, but not his photos. Pennsylvania Station, New York, 1954. If all we saw was the couple, this could be a romantic goodbye. Instead, they're huddled against a row of lockers in the middle of the train station with blurred outlines of passing strangers in the foreground. He's got his back to the escalator. She's facing away from the camera, her foot frozen in a half step behind her. His profile looks out over the lobby. She's just a head of hair. Because of this, instead of seeming tender, his hand on her back looks like him holding her against her will. My mother always swore there was no connection between her photographs and her life, but there's a reason people notice what they do. Knowing what I know, I can't look at this one without thinking of my mother as the woman trapped by that man's arm. Just because Lillian would have hated that idea doesn't make it any less true. Deborah Brodsky. It was the beginning of September. Judy and I were collating the first issue of On the Wind, and it was around 2 a.m. We had the windows open because summer hadn't let up. To keep the page spreads of the poetry journal from blowing around, we had each stack weighted down with a piece of silverware or an ashtray. Judy and I were down to our underwear, partly from the heat and partly from sexiness. Due to that first issue having begun back around the same time we had, we made quite a few of those finished pages unfit for postage. Judy and me and the magazine scattered across the bed, our neat piles all askew, the breeze from the window having its way with things. I knew from the knock it was Lily because it was 3 soft taps like always. She and I both liked to work late, and she knew she was welcome so long as she saw light under my door. I didn't bother put anything on since it was just Lily, and Judy didn't bother putting anything on because everyone had a crush on Lily at one point or another. Lily wasn't holding her camera. What's wrong? I asked. When she said it had been 6 weeks, I dug her meaning right away. In those days, if you didn't do it in the first 8 weeks, it became much more difficult. And if you hadn't done it after 16 weeks, you couldn't do it at all. But in the first 8, you could at least go to someone. If that someone knew what he was doing, chances were pretty good that you wouldn't die. Lily told me that Charles didn't know, and she thought it would be cruel to tell him, which made sense considering how hard he'd taken it when she'd broken up with him the month before. I'd never needed an abortion, but Cass had, so the next day I got the number of the person she had used, who was an actual doctor, a Viennese gynecologist who used anesthesia and only charged $300. But when Lily called the number, it was disconnected. The best kind of abortion to get was a therapeutic one, because then it could be done legit in a hospital. For one of those, you had to get a shrink to say you needed it for mental health reasons, and none of us had the kind of bread shrinks required. Even if we had, a lot of shrinks wouldn't prescribe them. You never could tell. Tuesday, I spread the word that a friend of mine needed to know where to go. By Wednesday, I had a number. Lily had to call after 5 p.m., and then she had to ask for Mike and say she wanted a haircut. And if she said anything different, the person would hang up. It cost $500, and Lily only had $200. I gave her $150 that I'd been saving for the second issue, and Ronaldo got $150 from a married banker he was seeing. When I gave the money to Lily, she asked would I come with her. So, of course, I said yes. River of No Return, New York, 1954. The 4 women standing in front of this movie poster make it impossible to read without the title's help. Obviously, once you violate the art-life connection ban, knowing the photographer's situation at the time changes everything. But even if you're clueless about my mother's personal history, this one's got power. 4 women, all with their hair fresh out of hot rollers, all waiting for their dates while twisting their gloves in their hands. 4 versions of the same black handbag dangling from their wrists. Not one of those women is certain her man is going to show. Marilyn Monroe looks like she's smirking at them from the poster. A different photographer would have had you laughing along with Marilyn, but because this is Lillian's photograph, your eyes dart back and forth scanning the street, your gloves clenched in your hand. Deborah Brodsky. The day we took the BMT to Canarsie was the only time I saw Lily in the world empty-handed. I was a Long Island girl, and Lily had never crossed the East River, so heading into Brooklyn felt to both of us like traveling to a foreign country. Then we got there, and except for Virgin Marys on the front lawns instead of mezuzahs beside the front doors, it was exactly like where I'd grown up in Woodmere. Lots of small brick houses, kids playing kick the can. The familiarity made it feel like one of those dreams where you're back in school and everyone's staring because you're in your underwear. Not that anyone was staring, which only added to our paranoia because we felt conspicuous as hell. I don't know what we were expecting to find at the address, but it was a regular house like the rest. There were people in the living room, kids running in and out of the kitchen. I sat on the couch beside someone's grandma while a middle-aged guy with a paunch and a comb-over escorted Lily down a hallway. 10 minutes later, she was back, and I'd never seen her so pale. When we got outside, she handed over the cash. Ronaldo's was all there, she told me, but she owed me $50. I asked, was she all right? She was now, she said, and we got back on the BMT. Entry from Lillian Preston's journal, 1954. I thought his office was connected to the house and that Deb and I just happened to arrive at the wrong door. I assumed the man was leading me down the hall toward a proper examination room, but instead he brought me to a large walk-in closet in the back of a cluttered bedroom. Inside the closet was a metal table covered in white towels, stirrups made from rope with loops at the end hung from the ceiling. The man advised me to keep my shoes on. He told me he wouldn't use anesthesia because it wasn't safe. I had to promise not to scream or his kids would hear. When he held out his hand for the money, I gave him half and got out of there. And thus ends the formal presentation of my book. So now comes the part that I love, which is the questions and answers. So I hope you guys have some questions and hopefully I'll have some answers for you. You're muted, Marcy.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm muted. We've got some great questions that have come in, and I just want to tell you, first of all, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic. Your presentation completely brought the book to life, and I want to go out for a beer with you right now because of for so many reasons. But you're talking about mother. I have 2 boys who are 4 and 7. And I'm also a painter. And when you're talking about this layering of roles between being a mother, I almost said being a parent, but it's not being a parent, it's being a mother, and, and what that means, and being an artist, and how that changes your practice, and how the busyness of life changes it, and how time changes your craft and your art, whether it's writing, whether it's painting, whether it's whatever anybody does. It's so visceral for me right now. And because we're in this really, you see, I have a pen because I've been writing down things. Because we're in this really just sad and lonely and scary time right now, which is why we're doing this, which is actually so wonderful. My paintings have actually gotten really dark, a lot darker than they were pre-pandemic. Like, my colors are very dark. And so something that I'm wondering is, as you finished this book before things started, and as maybe you've continued with your writing practice during this time, do you find that any of this darkness is bleeding into your creative work?
Well, yeah, because I'm not doing any. Most writers I know, with the arrival of the pandemic, it shut us down. And I was examining this, and what I realized is I had been working on, oops, there goes my book. I'd been working on a fledgling novel idea, and kind of right around January, February, and then March came, and I wasn't able to do it anymore. And what I realized was happening is, at the beginning of working on a novel, that's when you're world building. You're starting from nothing and you're building it from the ground. You're looking at a blank page. That requires a degree of focus that I suddenly didn't have, because there were so many things that I had to think about. There were so many things competing for my time. But the other thing that it requires is a certain degree of trust that the world as you know it is, as I said, 8 years to write this book. So 8 years from now is what I'm working on. Is the world even going to be here in the form that I knew it, to care, to read? Is there anything that I have to say that's worth saying right now? So I had to stop writing prose. To be honest, I haven't returned to it yet. I have found other things to do. I've been working on a play for a long time, because that was mostly present. Revision is something I am capable of right now. If the world is already in place, I can tinker with it and work with it and move through it. So that has been something I've been doing. I've also been finding I can write scripts. I've actually also been working on a horror movie. Speaking of darkness, I can make people talk to each other. People talking, I can handle. The larger world building, too hard. So yeah, it's had a huge effect, I think, on artists all over.
That's good to hear. And I've seen, my kids are only 4 and 7, but it is a different kind of busy than when they were, 1 and 4. And I've seen my work evolve in different ways because of that. We do have a question. Speaking of playwriting, this is very interesting. So she says, let's see, let me make sure I'm on the right question. Okay, so Amy is asking, I also share a love of modern art, such as photography, and love the stories behind photographs. With a book so focused on the visual, did you visualize your scenes and characters like they are acting, or is your process much less visual?
Cool. Amy, that's an awesome question. I'm an extremely visual thinker. When I am writing, I'm picturing everything. And so that means when I'm doing historical research, I first have to get lots of photo reference so I can really picture the worlds that I want my characters to be walking in, so that I can basically close my eyes and have them walk through those worlds. The visual work I had to do for this book was kind of unique, because since I was making a photo catalog, a catalog from an exhibit, and I had to basically create, I forget how many, there's 100 something different photos that are referenced in this book. I'm going to give you a number, like 118 different photos that are referenced in this book. And so I had to picture each one of those photos individually. And so the way that I did it is, I think I mentioned how I was like doing a lot of research about photographers. once I started kind of thinking about the book in this concrete way, I started getting monographs of street photographers, and they were living with me on my desk, these monographs. And I had paged through all of them. And whenever I came to a photo that kind of seemed like the kind of work that I thought my photographer would do, that would be similar to the kind of work I could imagine Lillian doing, I put a little Post-it note on that page and kept going. And so I had that for about 7 or 8 books of photographs. And then as I was starting to write the book, whenever I got to where I'd need to reference another photo, I would page through all my monographs and I'd say, ooh, this one is doing a little bit of something of what I need to be doing at this phase in Lillian's work. And so what I ended up doing is sometimes a corner of a pre-existing photo was what I needed for my photo. So I would enlarge it in my imagination and describe it. And that became the photo that gets described in the book. Sometimes the background of a photo I needed, but I need to put in my own foreground. And so I did that. Sometimes the foreground is what I needed. I needed a different background. And sometimes I just invented photographs out of whole cloth. But the cool thing is because there's no images, I didn't have to get permission. I could describe anybody's photos I wanted. Now that said, I credit everybody. If you go to the back of the book in the acknowledgement section, there's a list of all the photographers whose work inspired me. You know, off the top of my head, Vivian Maier was a huge one. Gary Winogrand, Helen Levitt, those are some biggies too. A little bit Diane Arbus, not so much, although I love her work. Who else I'm forgetting? But anyway, they're all back there. And so you can take a look at the back and see the photographers whose work got me started.
I love that you took the time to credit your you know, inspiration. It's so important, you know, as artists that we do that with each other. Ari is asking, she says, I am curious about the character of Lillian. It seems like she is on the autism spectrum. I know that is a modern term, but I'm curious if that is something that you considered in the creation of her character.
You know, you are not the first person to ask that. If she is, I never thought about her as having that specific diagnosis, though certainly she has a lot of traits that are consistent with it. So, and the spectrum being a spectrum, she's probably somewhere on it for sure. The reason I think I don't picture her having it in kind of a traditional way is I do picture her as being able to read people's emotions. I do picture her as kind of having that, you know, brain that can allow her to process that. She is, however, obsessed. She is a woman obsessed with her work. She is a woman for whom her work can't ever be second. I think that there can be a lot of ways that can manifest in a person other than the spectrum that we're talking about. I think there are a lot of writers, a lot of other kinds of artists who they are obsessed by their work. They can't get away from their work. And so it affects them and they make choices in ways that in some ways could have kind of on the Venn diagram some areas of overlap with perhaps being on the spectrum, while not necessarily meaning that they're on the spectrum.
Absolutely. And I can name a few of my own. So Miriam is asking, did you come up with the descriptions of the photos or the interviews and journal entries first?
I think that I did them at the same time. It was sort of, as I worked, I would do a photo description and then I would do some, because I was basically working my way roughly chronologically through the life. And so I kind of did the photos and the descriptions and the interviews as I worked through the life, all as a way to talk about it all together. That said, sometimes I would do I would kind of interview one character all the way through and then interview another character all the way through. And so I would kind of do the chronologies and then kind of intersperse. This is getting a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's answering your question. So it's sort of just like a little bit of everything, I guess, all at once.
Well, speaking of, we have somebody else. Nancy is asking, could you speak to how you developed the form of the novel? Speaking of getting into the weeds.
Yeah, this is something else I stole. Speaking of things I'm stealing from people, one of my favorite authors.
Borrow like a something, steal like an artist. I forget the saying, but yeah,
because it's true. One of my favorite writers is a guy named Stephen Millhauser, and when I like a writer, I'm a completist. I want to read everything they've written, and so he has a collection of novellas. The collection is called Little Kingdoms. The novella in the center of that collection is called Pictures from an Exhibition. And it tells the story of a painter's life through his catalog. And so you get his paintings and kind of just the broad scope of his life, but it doesn't go into any detail. Reading that, however, I got really excited. I've always been interested in sort of alternative forms, alternative ways to tell a story. And when I hit upon that, I was like, oh my gosh, that is so cool. And I think there's so much more you can do with that. And I'm going to see if I can do it. So that novella was very specifically the inspiration for trying to do a catalog. Now, the thing that was interesting is his catalog was very strictly using a catalog form. It just had like the picture, the description. Well, I wasn't doing that so much. And I was thinking, oh gosh, is this straining credulity? Am I doing too much to still call it a catalog? But then in the middle of my work, there was a Diane Arbus exhibit that came, a retrospective that it was a traveling retrospective, but when it came to New York, it came to the Met. And I took a look at the catalog for that show, and it does the same thing. It had journal entries of Diane Arbus. It had interviews with people from her life. And I was like, I'm golden. It's a real thing. I can totally get away with this. So it was kind of this thing where life was imitating art for me in a way that was a really happy coincidence.
This is just such a well thought out novel, and I'm really immensely enjoying this conversation. Especially, even in terms of you mentioning finding discomfort and being labeled as a Jewish writer. I can absolutely relate to that when I got into the field of Jewish arts and culture. I'm an artist, and I went to a college that didn't have a very big Jewish population at all. And I kind of wondered if it would put me in a box that maybe was uncomfortable. But there's some sort of freedom within the boundaries, I find also. So I'm just appreciating, my point is that I'm appreciating so many things that you're saying right now and relating to them immensely. Let's see, we do have one more question, and this is from Sandra. She is asking, why did you introduce the story through Franny rather than just introducing Samantha and the exhibition?
That's another great question. So it being a catalog, that's I'm going to get in the weeds again. Starting out, just it being a catalog, I think if you just started out with picture number 1, title, description, a lot of readers would be like, what? I don't know what this is. I thought this was supposed to be a novel. So I knew I needed to come up with some sort of preface or introduction to kind of let the reader know what they're in for. Generally speaking, when a book is going to do something weird, it's good to cue the reader to kind of prepare them. And sometimes you can do that just with the opening sentence. Like if we think about Kafka's Metamorphosis, that first line, Gregor Samsa awoke one morning to discover he'd been turned into a giant vermin. So basically the first line says, reader, the guy's a bug. If you're with me, cool, read on. If you're not, and you can leave. And so it's laying down the groundwork. So for a structure this weird, I was going to be asking readers to read it in an unusual way. And so I felt like I needed a couple pages of introduction to kind of get them used to the idea and let them know what they were in for. And I actually played with a bunch of different ways to do that. And Franny ended up, I felt, being the kind of most entertaining and effective way to do it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been, again, so fantastic. I've gotten some messages from people in my book club here just saying thank you, and our book club read your book, and we're all sending each other messages about how fantastic you are. We all enjoyed reading the story, but to hear you read it out loud brings it to life. Your other books have now been ordered and will be read by all. So thank you. This has been wonderful. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your voice, your perspective. We appreciate your art. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for joining us.
And if there's anyone here who's from the MFA program at Vanderbilt, rock on, keep writing, and don't let what's happening now in so many ways get you down. You will come through this and come out the other end. So yay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.